When the king of late-night television died, there was no funeral, no grand Hollywood service, no lines of black cars, no public place for the world to say goodbye. Yet, in the silence that followed, one name echoed louder than any other. It was the name of a guest no one expected to ghost from a past he tried to erase. Who was this person? And why did their story haunt the final chapter of Johnny Carson's life? On January 23, 2005, the man who had tucked America into bed for 30 years passed away. Johnny Carson, the undisputed king of late night, died quietly at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. The official cause was respiratory failure, a result of the emphysema he had been battling. He was 79 years old. His nephew, Jeff Sotzing, released a simple, firm statement. He was surrounded by his family whose loss will be immeasurable. There will be no memorial service. The decision was shocking but perfectly in character. For a man who lived in the public eye, performing for an audience of millions every night, Johnny Carson was intensely private. His friend and fellow host Dick Cavett once recalled how socially uncomfortable Carson was. How he would strain just to make small talk with a few fans outside the studio. Ed McMahon, his loyal sidekick for 3 decades, famously said, Johnny was comfortable in front of 20 million people and completely uncomfortable in front of 20. He was often described as the most private public man who ever lived. So in death, he got the privacy he always craved. His body was cremated and the ashes were given to his wife, Alexis Moss. There would be no public gathering, no place for his famous friends and colleagues to share stories. The man whose final show was watched by an incredible 50 million people left this world. With only a handful of witnesses, the world mourned in the only ways it could. Tributes poured in from the highest offices. President George W. Bush called him a steady and reassuring presence. Jay Leno, his successor on The Tonight Show, called him the gold standard, and David Letterman, the man Carson himself saw as his true heir, gave perhaps the most moving tribute, saying, all of us who came after are pretenders. We will not see the likes of him again. Fans left flowers and notes on his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame and at Johnny Carson Park, across the street from the NBC studios, where he had made magic for so long. But with no funeral, how could there be a guest? And in a life filled with thousands of acquaintances and a few powerful enemies, whose name whispered in the aftermath of his death would have truly shocked everyone. The answer lies not with who was present, but with who was absent for so long. The unexpected guest wasn't a person who showed up that day. It was the ghost of a friendship so deep and a betrayal so bitter that it defined the rest of both their lives. It was the story of the one person Johnny Carson could never, ever forgive. To understand the end, you have to go back to the beginning. Before she was a household name, Joan Rivers was a struggling comedian. By the early 1960s, she had been working for years in seedy clubs in New York's Greenwich Village, passing a hat that sometimes didn't even come back. She had slept in her car, worked temp jobs to pay the bills, and even got banned from the Jack Paar version of The Tonight Show after one appearance. She had auditioned for Johnny Carson's Tonight Show 7 times and failed every single time. By 1965, at just 31 years old, many in the industry were telling her that her career was already over. Then came the night of February 17, 1965. It was a mercy booking, something her manager arranged as a favor because he also represented Bill Cosby. Rivers walked out onto that stage, convinced it was her last shot. But something incredible happened. She later recalled, it was one of those nights where everything goes right. The stars are in alignment, and the audience we just connected. She wasn't just funny, she was electric, and the one person who mattered most saw it. As her set ended and she sat down on the coveted couch next to the host, Johnny Carson leaned in and said the words that would change her life forever. On national television, he told her, "You're going to be a star." Rivers remembered looking behind her, wondering who he could possibly be talking to. She described the on-air chemistry between them as absolutely magical. In that moment, a bond was forged. Carson didn't just give her a break. He became her champion, her mentor. As she would say for years to come, he handed me my career. From that night on, Joan Rivers was a regular on The Tonight Show. She made nearly 100 appearances over the next 2 decades. Their on-air banter was legendary. He was the cool, unflappable king, and she was the sharp, hilarious court jester who could make him genuinely laugh until he cried. His belief in her was real. When Rivers launched her own short-lived daytime talk show in 1968, Johnny Carson was her very first celebrity guest, a massive show of support. Her role on the show grew and grew. She began filling in as a substitute host when Carson was on vacation, and by 1983, she was officially named the show's permanent guest host. This was a position of immense trust. When Johnny was away, the keys to the kingdom were hers. She was, in the eyes of the public and the industry, the queen in waiting. Her loyalty to Carson was absolute. She later said that she had received many offers to host her own program over the years, but always turned them down to stay with The Tonight Show. But here is the detail that changes everything. For all their on-air warmth, their relationship was almost entirely professional. It existed under the hot studio lights and in front of the cameras. Rivers herself wrote, "Our friendship existed entirely on camera, in front of America. And even then, during the commercial breaks, when the red light went off, we had nothing to say to each other. This wasn't because they disliked each other. It was because of Carson's legendary aloofness. He was a man who built walls around himself. Theirs wasn't a relationship of close friends who confided in each other. It was a professional hierarchy. He was the king, the benefactor who had discovered her and given her a place in his court. And that unspoken power dynamic is the key to understanding the brutal betrayal that was to come." By the mid-1980s, the ground beneath Joan Rivers' feet began to feel unsteady. For years, she had felt secure in her role as Carson's number two. But things started to change. In 1985, Carson signed a new 2-year contract with NBC. Rivers, however, was only offered a 1-year deal. To her, the message was clear. She wrote, "It could only mean one thing. The powers were uncertain about my future." Then came the bigger blow. A memo began circulating at NBC listing the names of comedians being considered as possible permanent replacements for Johnny when he eventually decided to retire. Rivers, who had logged more hours in that chair than anyone besides Johnny himself, assumed her name would be at the top of the list. But when she saw it, she was gutted her name wasn't on it at all. She came to a painful conclusion. NBC would never give the host spot to a woman. She felt her role as guest host was a safe way for the network to use her talent without ever seeing her as a true competitor or successor. To the King. It was at this exact moment of vulnerability that a new player entered the game. A fledgling network called Fox was preparing to launch, and its executives, including Barry Diller, wanted to make a huge splash. They approached Joan Rivers with an offer that was impossible to ignore. Her own late-night talk show, The Late Show, starring Joan Rivers. The show would air in the exact same time slot directly opposite The Tonight Show, and the salary was a staggering $10 million. Many times what she was making at NBC. Rivers was faced with an agonizing decision. Her loyalty was to Johnny, the man who had made her, but she felt disrespected and discarded by the network he worked for. Her husband and manager, Edgar Rosenberg, gave her some critical advice. He told her not to say a word to Carson until the contract with Fox was signed and finalized. His reasoning was based on cold, hard Hollywood logic. Other comedians who had been regulars on The Tonight Show and left to start competing shows were often immediately banned from appearing on Carson's program. If she told Johnny and then the Fox deal fell through for some reason, she could be left with nothing. Even worse, they both feared that the famously powerful Carson could make one quiet phone call and kill her deal before it ever happened. So she kept silent, a decision she would come to regret for the rest of her life. The weekend before the official announcement, the news leaked. What happened next depends entirely on who you believe, as to completely different versions of the story emerged. According to Joan Rivers, she was horrified that he heard it from someone else. She immediately tried to call him to explain. She said she finally got him on the phone and told him she was leaving to host her own show on Fox. He said nothing. He just hung up. She called back thinking they must have been disconnected. He hung up on her a second time. That was it. They would never speak again. Johnny Carson's version was starkly different. He claimed that phone call never happened. He told people that he learned about her new show from a press release. Just like the rest of the world, he felt completely blindsided, ambushed, and betrayed by the person he had championed for over 20 years. Why was his reaction so extreme? Other male comedians had left to do their own shows, and while there might have been tension, Carson had often given them his blessing. Rivers had her own theory, one that cut much deeper than simple professional competition. She later wrote, "I think he really felt because I was a woman that I just was his, that I wouldn't leave him. I think it was a question of I found you and you're my property. He didn't like that as a woman. I went up against him. In Carson's world, a man leaving to compete was ambition. A woman leaving was treason. The king had been defied, and his wrath would be swift and devastating. Johnny Carson, the most powerful man in television, used his influence to punish her in every way he could. The first and most obvious consequence was that she was immediately and permanently banned from The Tonight Show for the rest of Carson's tenure, and even for years after he retired. She was not welcome in the studio that had been her second home. But it went much further than that. Carson created what was essentially a blacklist. Anyone who appeared as a guest on The Late Show starring Joan Rivers was told they would no longer be welcome on The Tonight Show. For celebrities and their agents, the choice was simple. You could go on a struggling news show on the upstart network, or you could go on the most important and powerful show in television history. Almost everyone chose Carson. Rivers found it nearly impossible to book a list guest. An NBC executive, a personal friend of hers, allegedly told her bluntly, "We are going to destroy you." The Late Show premiered on October 9th, 1986, and almost immediately ran into trouble. Without big-name guests and facing the full force of Carson's ratings juggernaut, the show struggled. Behind the scenes, things were even worse. Rivers' husband Edgar, who was a producer on the show, clashed constantly with Fox executives. After less than a year, the network gave Joan an ultimatum: fire her husband. She refused. So in May of 1987, Fox fired them both. The professional humiliation was immense, but it was about to be overshadowed by an unimaginable personal tragedy. The failure of the show, the massive debts they had incurred, and the public downfall put an unbearable strain on her marriage. 3 months after they were fired, Edgar Rosenberg took his own life. In the darkest moment of her life, Joan Rivers was completely alone. Her career was in ruins. Her husband was gone. And through it all, from the man who had once been her greatest champion, there was only silence. Johnny Carson never called. He never sent a note. He never expressed a single word of condolence. This single act, or lack of one, transformed the feud from a bitter Hollywood dispute into a truly dark and tragic story. It revealed a side of Carson that his adoring audience never saw, a man whose grudge was so deep that it overrode any sense of common decency or compassion. As Rivers would later say, describing her complete isolation from the world she once ruled, "It was like Stalin had sent me to Siberia. The king had passed his sentence, and it was absolute." Now, let's return to that quiet day in January 2005. As the news of Johnny Carson's death spread, the story of his epic, unresolved feud with Joan Rivers was one of the first things that came to everyone's mind. She was the ghost that haunted his legacy, the one loose end that the master of control could never tie up. In the absence of a real funeral, her story became the eulogy he never got. She was the unexpected guest. Her reaction to his passing was as complicated and raw as their history. There was no simple statement of grief. Instead, her public comments were a tangled mix of lingering bitterness, deep hurt, and a surprising amount of professional respect. In one interview, she was brutally honest, calling him a mean son of a bitch. But in the very next breath, she would add that he was also the most brilliant straight man ever. Nobody touches him. The pain was still fresh. Even after nearly 2 decades of silence, she didn't express regret for taking the Fox show. But she did mourn the opportunity for grace that Carson had thrown away. In an interview given shortly before her own death, she imagined a different ending to their story. "What Johnny should have done," she said, "after the whole thing, after I left the show and after I was fired from Fox and after Edgar committed suicide, Johnny should have had me back on the show and said to me, 'Where you been?' It would have made all the newspapers and they should have picked right up. It would have been a moment of forgiveness, a classy move from the classiest man on television." But it never happened. Even years after his death, Rivers was still searching for some kind of closure. On an episode of her reality show, Joan and Melissa, Joan Knows Best, she visited the cemetery where Carson's ashes were interred. The cameras followed as she tried to finally confront the man who had shut her out of his life, speaking to the empty air in a final, heartbreaking attempt to make peace. This is why Joan Rivers was the true guest at Johnny Carson's funeral. While he had retreated into his intensely private world after retiring in 1992, never speaking publicly about the feud, she had been forced to live with the consequences out in the open. For years, she was the sole historian of their broken friendship, telling her side of the story in interviews and on stage because his side was only silence. At the moment of his death, Her voice and her pain were the loudest echoes of his past. The unexpected guest wasn't a person standing in a church. It was the unavoidable, tragic, and unforgettable memory of the one person he built up and the one person he could never forgive. In the end, Johnny Carson got the quiet exit he always wanted. There was no public spectacle, no grand memorial, but that silence was filled by the story of the one person he could never forgive. The most unexpected guest at the end of his life wasn't a person at all, but the memory of a friendship he created with a single sentence and destroyed with the click of a telephone. It was a final silent testament to the absolute loyalty he demanded and the unforgivable price of betrayal in the court of the king of late night.